My name is Liam, and it is important to state from the outset that I did not go to sea seeking adventure. There was no romance in my decision, no siren call of the exotic ports, or the boundless, blue freedom of the ocean. For me, the sea was an escape, a place vast and indifferent enough to swallow the noise of a life I had comprehensively wrecked ashore. I sought the anonymity of a grueling, repetitive job, a routine so physically demanding it would leave no room for memory or regret. The maritime industry, I discovered, asks for little more than a strong back, a clean bill of health, and a willingness to trade months of your life for a paycheck and the obliteration of distance. I had all three in abundance. After securing the necessary credentials, a process that involved more paperwork than I'd anticipated, and a 5-day basic safety training course that taught me more ways to die at sea than I cared to know, I signed on as an ordinary seaman, an OS, the lowest rung on the deck department's ladder. My duties would be simple, mindless, and dirty: chipping rust, painting, greasing gear, and standing watch. It was perfect. The vessel I was assigned to was a container ship, a veteran of the seas named the MV Airbus. The name, I would later learn, was not a coincidence. It was a warning. Boarding the Airbus for the first time was an exercise in humility. It wasn't just a ship. It was a floating metropolis of steel, a moving mountain range of cargo containers, stacked 7 high, each one a mystery box of global commerce. The air was thick with the smells of salt, diesel exhaust, and something else, a deeper, metallic scent of decay, as if the rust was a kind of living organism slowly consuming the vessel from within. A constant, low-frequency hum vibrated up through the soles of my boots, the ceaseless heartbeat of the engines deep in the ship's guts. It was a sound I would come to associate with a very specific kind of dread. The living conditions were as Spartan as I had hoped. My cabin was a small, steel-walled box with a bunk, a small desk, and a porthole that offered a view of more steel. Privacy was a luxury afforded by a closed door, but never by silence. The ship groaned and creaked around me, a constant symphony of stress and strain. The other crew members were a collection of ghosts in boiler suits. They were professionals, Filipino, Russian, Ukrainian, men with wary eyes and an insular quietness born of long contracts and immense fatigue. They moved with an economy of motion, their faces set in masks of grim endurance. There were no friendly welcomes, only curt nods and a shared understanding that we were all here to do a job that took us thousands of miles from anyone who mattered. We were a community of isolates, sharing a floating prison. On my first day, after stowing my meager belongings, I was summoned to the bridge. The journey there was a disorienting trek through a labyrinth of narrow corridors and steep ladders. The bridge itself was a stark contrast to the rest of the aging vessel. It was a bubble of modern technology, a darkened room illuminated by the soft, multicolored glow of radar screens, GPS plotters, and digital charts. It was the ship's brain, a place of quiet, focused tension. Standing at the center of it all was the captain. He was an older man, perhaps in his late 60s, with a face that looked like it had been carved from driftwood and left out in the sun. His authority was absolute, an invisible pressure in the room that demanded silence and obedience. He didn't offer a handshake or a greeting. He simply turned his pale, assessing eyes on me, and for a long moment, he said nothing. I felt like a specimen under a microscope. "You are the new OS," he stated. It wasn't a question. His voice was gravelly, a low rumble like stones grinding together. "Yes, Captain," I replied. He gestured to the chart table. Lying there was not a modern binder or a clipboard, but a large, heavy ledger. It was bound in dark, cracked leather, the kind of antique you'd expect to find in a dusty archive, not on the bridge of a working cargo ship. Its pages were yellowed with age, and the brass corners were tarnished green. "Your predecessor was careless," the captain said, his gaze never leaving mine. He failed to appreciate the importance of procedure. This vessel operates on a strict set of protocols. They are not suggestions. They are the terms of our survival. He opened the ledger. The pages were filled with entries, in a dizzying array of handwriting, some inelegant, looping cursive, others in a frantic, spidery scrawl. It was a log, but it spanned decades, maybe longer. He turned to a specific page, marked with a faded red ribbon. The heading was written in stark, block letters. "Atjans far nebu hence." "Read," he commanded. I leaned over the table, my initial thought being that this was some kind of elaborate hazing ritual, a tradition to spook the new guy. But the captain's face was devoid of any humor. It was a mask of grim finality. I looked down at the handwritten rules. The ink faded but perfectly legible. 1. Your watch schedule is non-negotiable. Be on deck 5 minutes early. Never be late. Tardiness is an invitation. 2. All maintenance, chipping rust, painting must be performed from bow to stern during daylight. Never work towards the bow. Never work after the sun has set. It notices movement in the dark. 3. If you hear a song that sounds like a woman humming from a ventilation shaft, find the nearest sealed room and do not leave for 10 minutes. Do not listen to the melody. 4. The ship's manifest is a lie. The containers in Bay 12 are not to be inspected, secured, or approached for any reason. The chief mate handles Bay 12. 5. If, during your watch, you see a man on deck in a soaked, dark peacoat, do not make eye contact. Do not speak to him. He is not part of this crew. He is looking for his ship. Do not help him find it. 6. Never enter the chart room alone between the hours of L100 or 200 and the O24 C100. The old maps are being consulted. 7. If a crewmate offers you a piece of salt beef after evening quarters, refuse it politely. That crewmate is no longer who you think they are. Report it to the chief mate using the code. The larder is spoiled. 8. Do not look at your reflection in the black water of the open ocean at night. It might not be your reflection looking back. I finished reading and looked up, a nervous laugh threatening to escape my lips. The rules were absurd, a collection of sailors, superstitions, and cryptic warnings that belonged in a cheap horror novel, not a ship's official orders. Rule 23 sounded like a garbled version of the Siren myth. Rule 5, a ghost story about the Flying Dutchman. The one about the salt beef was pure paranoia. designed to sow distrust among a crew already isolated from the world. "Is this a joke, Captain?" I asked, trying to keep my tone respectful. The captain's expression did not change. If anything, it hardened. "Do I look like a man who jokes, Mr. Nolan?" he asked, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "There are forces in this world, especially in the deep places of the ocean, that defy easy explanation. This ship, the Erebus, has an arrangement with them. These rules are not for my benefit. They are for yours. They are the difference between you finishing your contract and being listed in this ledger as lost at sea." He closed the heavy book with a soft, final thud that seemed to echo in the silent bridge. The sound seemed to seal my fate. "You will learn them. You will obey them," he continued, his eyes boring into me. "And you will never, ever speak of them to anyone outside of this vessel. The world ashore is not ready for these truths. Your duties begin with the morning watch. Do not be late." He turned away, dismissing me. I walked out of the bridge and back into the groaning steel corridors of the ship. The captain's words and the impossible list of rules churning in my mind. The low hum of the engines seemed deeper now, more menacing. The smell of decay felt stronger. I had come to the sea to escape the ghosts of my past, but as the Erebus slid silently through the dark water, I had the sinking feeling that I had just signed on to a vessel that was haunted by something far, far worse. The first week at sea was a blur of exhaustion and punishing physical labor. My life shrank to the rhythm of the watch schedule. 4 hours on, 8 hours off, a cycle dictated by the ship's bell that cared nothing for day or night. As an ordinary seaman, I was at the beck and call of the boatswain, a burly, taciturn Filipino man, whose hands were like leather mallets. My duties were the dirtiest on the ship. I chipped away endless patches of rust that bloomed like a disease on the steel decks. The rhythmic tink, tink of my hammer a pathetic counterpoint to the engine's deep thrum. I painted over the exposed metal with thick, acrid-smelling primer. I greased winches, coiled ropes, and scrubbed decks until my back screamed, and my hands were raw. It was exactly the kind of mindless oblivion I had craved. During the day, under the vast, indifferent sky, I could almost forget the captain's ledger and its list of impossible rules. I tried to convince myself it was an elaborate, cruel joke, a psychological test for the new man. But the behavior of the crew was a constant, unsettling reminder. They were a quiet, almost monastic brotherhood of the weary. They performed their duties with a grim efficiency that left no room for error or deviation. I noticed it most during the daily maintenance. The bosun would start us at the very tip of the bow, and we would work our way aft towards the stern. No one ever questioned it. No one ever suggested a more efficient pattern. If a tool was dropped, you walked the long way around to retrieve it, always keeping the work behind you. You never, ever worked towards the bow. And as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, a palpable tension would ripple through the men on deck. Tools were collected with a quiet urgency. Work stopped a full hour before sunset, no matter the task's state of completion. The second rule from the ledger: never work after the sun has set. It notices movement in the dark, was observed with the absolute devotion of religious law. My first test came on the 5th day. We were painting a section of railing on the main deck. The afternoon was hot, the work was slow, and I was lost in the repetitive motion of the roller. I didn't notice the sun bleeding orange and purple across the waves until the bosun barked an order to pack up. In my haste, I knocked over a can of gray paint, sending a puddle spreading across the deck plates. "Idiot!" the bosun hissed, his eyes wide with something more than just anger. It was fear. "I'll clean it up," I said quickly, grabbing a handful of rags. "No time," he snapped, grabbing my arm. "We go now." "But it'll ruin the deck," I protested, pulling away. The sun was still a sliver above the water. We had a few minutes. He didn't argue. He simply pointed towards the stern with a trembling finger. I followed his gaze. The ship's shadow was stretching, long and black, across the water. But it was the shadow on the deck that held his attention. It was crawling, elongating unnaturally fast, consuming the light. And where the shadow fell, the air grew still and cold. The low hum of the engines seemed to dip, to become distorted, as if passing through water. I felt a pressure in my ears, a profound and unnerving silence that was somehow louder than the noise it replaced. I looked back at the spilled paint. In the dying light, for a split second, I thought I saw the puddle ripple, not from the ship's motion, but as if something had stirred beneath its surface. I didn't need another warning. I dropped the rags and practically ran after the rest of the crew, my heart hammering against my ribs. No one spoke as we secured the gear and retreated into the lighted superstructure of the ship. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind us, and the normal sounds of the Airbus rushed back in, chasing away the terrible silence. The bosun shot me a look of pure venom and said, "You are lucky. It was not fully dark." He never mentioned the incident again, but after that, I was the first to pack up my tools. The rules were real. That chilling realization poisoned the sense of escape I had sought. The ship was no longer a refuge. It was a cage, and we were trapped inside with things that followed a set of ancient, malevolent agreements. My sleep became shallow, punctuated by the groans and creaks of the ship, each sound a potential threat. It was during one of these fitful nights, lying in my bunk, that I encountered the third rule. If you hear a song that sounds like a woman humming from a ventilation shaft, find the nearest sealed room and do not leave for 10 minutes. Do not listen to the melody. It started faintly, a high, sweet sound that I first mistook for the whine of a distant pump. But it grew steadily, resolving itself into a clear, melodic humming. It was a simple, beautiful tune, a lullaby that seemed to tug at a half-forgotten childhood memory. It was deeply comforting, and my exhausted mind yearned to drift off to it. I felt my eyelids grow heavy, a pleasant warmth spreading through my limbs. The sound was coming from the small, circular vent above my desk. Without thinking, I sat up, wanting to hear it more clearly, wanting to place the familiar, lovely tune. Then, The captain's words echoed in my head. Do not listen to the melody. Ice flooded my veins. I scrambled out of my bunk, my heart seizing with panic. The melody seemed to grow louder, more insistent, wrapping around me like a physical presence. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard, and every instinct told me to stay, to listen, to let it soothe away the fear and the fatigue. It promised peace. It promised rest. I clamped my hands over my ears and stumbled out of my cabin into the dim, red, lit corridor. The humming was everywhere now, seeping from every vent, vibrating in the steel plates beneath my bare feet. Find the nearest sealed room. My cabin door wasn't sealed. The corridor was a tunnel of the sound. A small supply closet stood 20 feet away. I lunged for it, my breath catching in my throat. The handle was cold and stiff. I threw my shoulder against the door, wrenched the handle, and tumbled inside, pulling the heavy door shut behind me. I was plunged into absolute darkness and a silence broken only by my own ragged breathing. The closet smelled of rust and cleaning chemicals. I pressed my back against the door, my body trembling uncontrollably. Outside, the humming continued. It changed then, the beautiful melody twisting into something discordant and searching. I could feel it probing at the door, a pressure against the steel, seeking a crack, a way in. I squeezed my eyes shut, counting the seconds, my mind replaying the tune, fighting the urge to hum it myself. It felt like an eternity, but eventually, the pressure receded. The sound faded, leaving behind the familiar, groaning heartbeat of the Erebus. I stayed in that closet for a full half-hour before I dared to open the door. The next day, I saw Andrei, a veteran Russian AB, checking the lashings on a stack of containers. His face was a roadmap of exhaustion, but his eyes were sharp. I approached him, desperate for some kind of explanation, some human connection in this shared nightmare. Andrei, I began, my voice low. Last night, the humming. His head snapped up. The casual wariness in his eyes was replaced by a stark, cold fear. He glanced around the empty deck, then grabbed my arm in a grip of steel. He pulled me behind a container, out of sight of the bridge. You do not speak of it, he whispered, his Russian accent thick and harsh. You heard it. You locked the door. I nodded, my throat dry. Good, he grunted, releasing me. You are not as stupid as you look. You follow the rules. All of them. You do not ask questions. You do your work, you take your pay, and you pray you see land again. That is all. He turned and walked away, leaving me alone with the chilling finality of his words. There was no help to be had. There was only obedience. That night, I had the midnight to 4 a.m. watch. The sea was a vast, featureless expanse of black, indistinguishable from the starless, overcast sky. The air was cold and damp. I stood on the bridge wing, the wind whipping at my jacket, my senses on high alert. I thought of the man in the peacoat, of the salt beef, of the chart room I was forbidden to enter. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking shape. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. To steady myself, I leaned on the railing, staring down at the dark water churning alongside the hull. And then, I remembered the last rule. Do not look at your reflection in the black water of the open ocean at night. It might not be your reflection looking back. A cold dread, worse than anything I had felt before, washed over me. I had been staring at the water for a full minute. Slowly, against every screaming instinct, I forced my eyes downward. The ship's lights cast a faint, distorted glow on the waves. I could see a vague shape there, a pale oval of a face, dark smudges for eyes and a mouth. My reflection, it was just me. A wave of relief so powerful, it made me dizzy, washed through me. It was just a superstition, after all. I smiled, a weak, trembling thing. And in the black water below, my reflection smiled back. But it wasn't my smile. It was wide and utterly, terrifyingly hungry. I scrambled backward from the railing, my boots slipping on the damp steel of the bridge wing. My breath came in ragged, panicked gasps. The image was seared onto the inside of my eyelids, the pale, watery oval of my face twisted into a grin of pure, predatory hunger. It was a violation, a deep and personal mockery of my very existence. For the rest of my watch, I was useless. I stood with my back pressed against the bulkhead of the superstructure, my gaze fixed firmly on the deck, tracing the patterns of rust and old paint. I refused to look at the ocean. I couldn't. The fear was too great that I would see it again, that this time it would wave back with my own hand. Was I going mad? The thought was a cold comfort. Madness would be an explanation, a rational diagnosis for an irrational experience. But deep in my gut, I knew I wasn't mad. The ship was real, the rules were real, and the things they were meant to protect us from were real, too. The Erebus was a vessel sailing, not just on the ocean, but on a sea of dark agreements and ancient, hungry things. The hungry smile I saw was not a hallucination. It was a promise. The days that followed were a slow descent into paranoia. Sleep offered no escape, only a shallow, dream-haunted reprieve. Every creak of the ship's hull was a footstep in the corridor. Every shadow in a corner was a waiting figure. I performed my duties on autopilot, my mind a frantic loop of the captain's rules. I chipped rust, I painted, I greased gears, always moving from bow to stern, always finishing before the sun bled out across the horizon. I became a model of obedience, because obedience was the only shield I had. The crew remained a collection of strangers, but now my isolation felt different. It was no longer just the professional distance of men doing a hard job. It was a tactical necessity. I watched them from the corner of my eye, studying their faces, their movements. Who among them had heard the humming? Who had seen the man in the peacoat? Who had refused the salt beef? The seventh rule had burrowed into my mind, transforming the mess hall from a place of brief respite into a minefield of potential threats. If a crewmate offers you a piece of salt beef, after evening quarters, refuse it politely. That crewmate is no longer who you think they are. Report it to the chief mate using the code. The larder is spoiled. It happened a week after I saw my reflection. We were in the mess, the air thick with the smell of boiled potatoes and stew. I was hunched over my tray, forcing down the bland food, when one of the Ukrainian ABs, a man named Sasha, sat opposite me. He was a big man with a perpetually tired face, but he'd always given me a curt, non-hostile nod when we passed. He was as close to a friend as I had on this floating purgatory. He slid a small, greasy piece of dark meat across the table toward me. "Extra ration," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You are skinny. Need meat on your bones." I froze, my spoon halfway to my mouth. It was salt beef. My blood ran cold. I looked at Sasha's face. His eyes were the same tired blue they had always been. There was a faint, almost friendly smile on his lips. Nothing seemed out of place, but the rule was absolute.
"No, thank you,"
I said, my voice barely a whisper. I cleared my throat, trying to sound casual. "My stomach, it is not good today." Sasha's smile didn't falter, but his eyes held mine for a fraction too long. An unnerving stillness settled over him. "As good?" he insisted, pushing the meat a little closer. "Good salt."
"Curacao."
"I can't," I said, more forcefully this time, pushing the small plate back towards him. "Thank you, but no." For a long moment, he just stared at me. The ambient noise of the mess hall, the clatter of cutlery, the low murmur of conversations in a half-dozen languages seemed to fade away. It was just me and Sasha, and the piece of meat between us. Then, the moment broke. He shrugged, a gesture that seemed almost too casual, and popped the piece of beef into his own mouth. He chewed slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. I felt a profound, animal terror. I mumbled an excuse and fled the mess hall, the feeling of his gaze burning into my back. I knew what I had to do. The chief mate was the ship's second in command, a wary, hawk-faced Filipino man who moved with a silent, coiled intensity. He was even more remote than the captain. A man who seemed to communicate only in orders and disapproving glares. Finding him alone was difficult, but I eventually cornered him as he was leaving the chart room. "Chief mate," I said, my heart hammering. He turned, his expression one of pure annoyance. "What?" I swallowed hard, the coded words feeling foolish and theatrical on my tongue. "Sir, the larder is spoiled." The change was instantaneous and terrifying. The annoyance in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by an expression of absolute, cold gravity. It was the look of a man hearing a confirmed casualty report. He didn't ask who, or when, or how I knew. He didn't have to. He simply gave a single, sharp nod. "Understood," he said, his voice low and devoid of any emotion. "Go to your cabin. You were never here. This conversation did not happen. You will not speak of this to anyone. Ever." He turned and walked away, leaving me trembling in the corridor. The next day, Sasha was gone. I didn't see him on deck, or in the mess hall, or in the passageways. It was as if he had never existed. I asked another seaman about him, a Russian I'd worked with. The man just gave me a blank look. "Sasha. There is no Sasha in this crew." The denial was so flat, so complete, that I almost believed him. I started to doubt my own memory, my own sanity. Had I invented him? But I knew I hadn't. The Erebus wasn't just haunted. It was actively editing itself, pruning its crew, erasing its history. My duties became my only anchor to reality. A few days later, the bosun assigned me to a chipping and painting detail on the aft deck, near Bay 12. The name sent a fresh spike of fear through me. Rule 1.4. The ship's manifest is a lie. The containers in Bay 12 are not to be inspected, secured, or approached for any reason. The chief mate handles Bay 12. The containers in Bay 12 were different from the others. They were older, a mottled collection of rust-streaked, unmarked boxes that looked like they had been at sea for 100 years. They bore no logos, no serial numbers. They were anonymous, silent monoliths. I tried to keep my distance, focusing on my work. The rhythmic tink, tink, tink of my hammer, the only sound besides the endless rush of the sea. But then I heard another sound. It was faint at first, a soft, rhythmic scratching coming from inside one of the containers. Scratch, pause, scratch, pause. It was a sound that did not belong, the sound of a trapped animal. My blood froze. I lowered my hammer, listening. The scratching was steady, patient, and it was coming from the container closest to me. I took an involuntary step closer, my mind screaming at me to run. As I hesitated, I saw the chief mate approaching. He was carrying a heavy, lumpy canvas sack over his shoulder. He didn't seem to see me. He moved with a grim purpose, heading directly for the container that was making the noise. He pulled a heavy, old-fashioned key from his pocket and fitted it into the container's locking mechanism. I ducked behind a winch, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. The chief mate grunted with effort as he swung the heavy steel door open. The scratching sound stopped instantly. For a single, horrifying second, I saw a glimpse of the interior before the door blocked my view. It wasn't filled with cargo. It was empty. The steel walls stained with something dark and covered in deep, frantic gouges, as if a beast had been clawing at the metal for an eternity. The chief mate hefted the canvas sack from his shoulder. It squirmed in his grip. He threw it into the darkness of the container. I heard a soft, wet thud, followed by a new sound. A low, guttural tearing, and a thick, slurping noise that made my stomach heave. The chief mate slammed the door shut, the heavy bolt clicking into place with a sound of absolute finality. He stood for a moment, his back to me, before turning and walking away, leaving me alone with the silence and the horrifying knowledge of what the Erebus was truly carrying. It wasn't cargo. It was food. The knowledge of what was in Bay 12 festered inside me like a sickness. The ship was no longer just a haunted vessel. It was a mobile abattoir, a charnel house, sailing a predetermined course of sacrifice. My work became a hollow pantomime. I chipped rust and painted steel, but my mind was filled with the sound of scratching from within a metal box, the wet thud of the canvas sack, and the slurping, tearing noises that followed. I was now an accomplice. My silence was complicity. The remaining week of our voyage was steeped in a suffocating tension. The other crew members, who had once been merely distant, now actively avoided me. Their eyes would slide away when I approached. Conversations would cease. I realized they knew I had seen the chief mate. I had witnessed the feeding. In the unspoken hierarchy of this ship, I had crossed a line. I was no longer just a new hand learning the ropes. I was a witness, a loose thread in the tightly woven fabric of their monstrous secret. The isolation I had once craved had become a form of solitary confinement, and I was terrified of what sentence would be passed. My fear was a physical thing, a cold weight in my stomach that never left. I ate little, slept less. The rules, which had once been my shield, now felt like the bars of my cage. I found myself reciting them in my head, a frantic mantra against the encroaching madness. Do not listen to the melody. Do not speak to the man in the peacoat. Do not look at your reflection. But there was no rule for what I had seen. There was no protocol for knowing that we were ferrying caged gods or devils across the ocean, and that their sustenance was the flesh of the disappeared. The night before we were due to make port, my terror finally curdled into a desperate, reckless need for answers. I couldn't bear the not knowing anymore. I couldn't face the idea of stepping back onto dry land with this horror locked behind my teeth, wondering if I would be allowed to leave, or if I would simply be raced, like Sasha. There was one rule I had yet to break, one sanctuary of secrets I had yet to violate. Never enter the chart room alone between the hours of 0200 and 0400. The old maps are being consulted. At 0230, when the ship was deep in the belly of the night watch, I slipped out of my cabin. The corridors were lit with the same dim red emergency lights, but they seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The hum of the engines felt like a predator's purr. I made my way to the bridge, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The chart room door was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped inside, pulling it softly shut behind me. The room was unnaturally cold. The air was still and heavy, like in a crypt. And on the large, wooden chart table, illuminated by a single low, hanging lamp, lay the ledger. It was open. Beside it, spread out like ancient scrolls, were not modern nautical charts, but old hand-drawn maps made of vellum or animal hide. They depicted coastlines I didn't recognize, with continents shaped strangely, as if from a forgotten age of the world. And in the middle of a vast, empty expanse of ocean, a location was circled in faded, brownish red ink. There were no coordinates, only a name written in archaic script, Leviathan's Rest. My hands trembling, I leaned over the ledger. It was open to a page filled with names, dozens of them, each followed by a date and a short, chilling epitaph. Lost at sea storm. Lost at sea accident. Lost at sea carelessness. I found the entry for my predecessor, Thomas Miller. Lost at sea, failed to observe protocol. He hadn't been careless. He had broken the rules. He had learned the truth. I flipped through the brittle pages. A history of dread and death spanning centuries. The handwriting changed. The ink faded. But the story was the same. This ship, or one like it, had been sailing this route for a very, very long time. It was a prison, a duty, a curse passed down through generations of sailors who were trapped by what they knew. The old maps are not for living eyes, Mr. Nolan. The captain's voice came from the darkness behind me. I didn't jump. The sound was so quiet, so final, it felt it had always been there. I turned slowly. He stood in the doorway, his face a mask of ancient wariness. He wasn't angry. He was just sad. "What is this ship?" I whispered, my voice cracking. It is a necessity, he said, stepping into the light. There are things in this world, Mr. Nolan, that were here long before us. Things that sleep in the deep places. So long as they sleep, the world is safe. But they hunger, even in their slumber. The Erebus is not a cargo ship. It is a key. It is a promise. We sail the old routes, the forgotten lines of power, and we keep the peace. We deliver the offering, so that they do not wake and come ashore to collect it themselves. My mind reeled. The containers in Bay 12, the scratching, Sasha. It all clicked into place with a horrifying, soul-crushing logic. We weren't just feeding them. We were jailers, wardens of a planetary prison. So, what happens now? I asked, my gaze falling back to the ledger, to the long list of the lost. Am I to be an accident? Another entry in your book. Your fate is not yet written, the captain said, his voice softening. But you cannot go back. You know the truth. The world ashore cannot handle this truth. It is a fragile, brittle thing, their reality. It would shatter. He walked to the table and turned the final page of the great ledger. There, on the last page, written in the same stark block letters as the heading for the rules, was a single, final regulation. It was unnumbered, an addendum to the covenant. THEC must es par. The chief mate has served his term, the captain said, his pale eyes meeting mine. He has performed his duties. He has earned his rest. He will go ashore. And he will speak of this to no one, because he knows the consequences. But the larder must still be tended. The offering must be made. The ship must have a keeper. Someone who understands the weight of the task. Someone who has seen the blood drained from my face, the canvas sack, the key, the tearing sounds. It was a job, a position, a life sentence. The next morning, the Erebus docked. The familiar sounds of port, the shouting of dock workers, the screech of cranes, felt alien, like sounds from another world. I stood on the deck and watched as the crew disembarked. The men who had avoided my gaze for a week now walked past me, their faces blank, their bags slung over their shoulders. They were free. The chief mate was the last to leave. He was dressed in civilian clothes, looking like any other man. He didn't look at me as he walked down the gangplank and vanished into the crowd. A ghost returning to a life I could no longer have. The captain came and stood beside me. He held out a set of large, old-fashioned iron keys. In the other hand, he held a heavy, empty canvas sack. The new hands will be boarding soon, he said quietly. They will need their rules. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was paralyzed by the sheer, crushing weight of my new reality. I had come to sea to escape my ghosts, and in doing so, I had become one. I looked down at my hands, and then at my faint reflection in the polished brass of the bridge window. The face that looked back was pale and thin, but for a fleeting, horrifying moment, I saw its lips pull back into a smile. It was wide and sharp and utterly, terrifyingly hungry. I had found my place on the Airbus. I took the keys.